Whenever you're ready, just put me wherever you want. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Okay, I think we're ready to welcome our next program. Again, on behalf of Miners Hall Museum and a lot of the board members who are here today, and Jerry Lomshak and myself who have set up this latest exhibit, and the volunteers who are helping, we'd like to welcome you again to this program. You know, Diana does a lot of work on microhistories, and so that got me thinking too about, you know, we live in a very unique place with camps. You know, I mean, I grew up with the idea of camps, and all the mines have been gone, what, 100 years, you know, but we still have the names of these camps, or we have an identity with a lot of them. Now, a good many of them are gone, but I started thinking of the names of the ones that we have and that we have kind of kept track of and had some family histories with, and I wanted to maybe mention a few of those. For example, you know, I know when my grandfather here in Franklin worked, he would identify working at a camp by a number, you know, so that would be kind of like Western Coal number 24. And then his friend would be at a mining camp at 41. And then we had Camp 50, or 50 Camp. But you think about 50 Camp, and it has survived with that lovely number. So, you know, you don't just say oh yeah, I live 2 miles west of Arma. I live in 50 Camp, you know, and there's still a small cluster of people there. Also, the whimsical animal names that many of these camps had. Do any of you recall Blue Goose, Dogtown, Foxtown, Frogtown, Chicken Ridge? Some of those are no longer here. There were garden variety names too. Red Onion. Anybody from Red Onion? How about Mulberry? Mulberry was founded in 1875 as a mining town, and it was named after a grove of wild mulberry trees that grew at an area where the local Indians would meet to hunt and to live. So that's where the town was actually built. And it continues today as a rather large community with a population, the consensus of 2020, of 409. So you still see a sign for Mulberry right down the street. What about the idyllic Breezy Hill? If you did a wrong turn and didn't go 2 miles west of Arma to Camp 50, but you went 2 miles east, you would end up in Breezy Hill. A lot of the camps were named for people. For example, Capaldo, Italian community, although no one knows really who Mr. Capaldo was. There is a lore that it was named after an Italian immigrant. Radley, Franklin. Franklin, I don't know if any of you've read in the paper just the other day, you know, the 100-year-old history that 100 years ago, when Franklin was actually established in 1907, 16 years after that, a newspaper article said, well, what was Franklin named for? You know, what was it? Was it named for Ben Franklin? Was it named for a resident? That mystery is still going on. We really don't. Diana, we need help here. We don't know that one. Some of the camps were named for places like Dunkirk. You know, I came from Dunkirk, a French community. Chicopee. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Little Italy, you know, from across the pond. Some were named for the coal companies that they served, like Coburg. And I want to kind of highlight just a couple of these camps. Coburg, you know, came actually about, it was 4 camps. Actually, you know, they had 4 different camps, and they were under the establishment of the Crow Coal Company. And they pretty much ran the show there in Coburg, so they just kind of united that particular 4 camp idea, and they came up with Coburg. It was established in 1908, and it still had a post office in 1972. And most of these camps had post offices. You know, they were all established places, a lot of them. Its consensus of the 2020 population numbers was 92. Scammon, a city in Cherokee County, its population right now runs at 376. and it was laid out in 1884. And it was brought about by 4 Scammon boys. They're the ones who started their mining company in Scammon. And then I think we've heard the history that David Mackey actually was the founder of the town of Scammon, and he was the president of the Scammon State Bank. But Scammon now really holds the Railroad History Group, as we all know, the heart of the heartlands, and that's based in Scammon. And then right next to it is Corona, where the depot is and the museum. Capaldo was established in 1912. Pretty much Italian immigrants lived there. And by 2000, it was annexed to Frontenac. But don't tell the people from Capaldo that. Because if you ask anything like, like where's the bacon plant? Well, you know where Capaldo is, don't you? There's a lot of identity in Capaldo. And to kind of really help that along, we now have signs. They have now honored the camp signs, because now we have Dunkirk has a little sign and Capaldo has a sign. In fact, Dunkirk is just a quarter of a mile north of Capaldo, but another small place that had its own post office, a theater at one time. And now there's just a cluster of homes, about 50 residents. A lot of my family live out there. West Mineral in Cherokee County has 154 people. But don't let that sway you, because guess what's at West Mineral? They have Big Brutus. And right now, Big Brutus is the largest electric steam shovel. It was the second largest, but it is now the largest preserved one that we have in the nation. And they have like 20,000 people come to visit their small community in West Mineral. Weir City. The population there is 569. Weir was founded in 1872 by a landowner, T.M. Weir, who donated 40 acres to the town site. And the first post office was established there in 1875. In 1873, the Weir City Zinc Company was formed, and if you really think about it, Weir was one of the first locations in Kansas where coal was mined commercially. And if you pretty much see, the whole town is pretty much undermined. There's 30 feet under there is probably nothing at Weir, but it's been so much overmined. It also had one interesting, when I was kind of looking at this, one interesting characteristic. In 1899, 200 African Americans traveled to Weir together from Parno, Illinois, where there was a major strike going on, a major labor strike, and there was a lot of violence there, and they were getting attacked. They did not want to go back to Alabama, so they all ended up coming here to Weir. Now there are the last 2 towns who have mysteries for their names that I just need to mention. And I know Jerry would know about this one, Chicopee, because he gave us a great history last week, but he didn't mention the fact of how did they get the name Chicopee? And I think Jerry's done research on this, now Chicopee has 422 great residents there right now, or at least according to the census. But the name Chicopee really comes from an indigenous native population from the East Coast. In fact, their language is Nipmuc, and in Nipmuc, Chicopee means rapid waters or rapids. And this particular tribe was part of the Algonquins. They were here before the colonists, and there is an established city, and I don't know, Jerry, I think it's the only other Chicopee in existence.
There's a few others, but that's the big
Is that right? In western Massachusetts, on the Connecticut River. Well, Jerry, I think, there's a lot of similarities here between these 2 sister cities. Let's see, the Indian language that comes from an eastern, indigenous group, not from Kansas or Oklahoma, not from any of our Native Americans here. Last time I looked, I didn't think we had a river running close to Chicopee, and Cow Creek.
They're certainly not rapid.
They're not rapid. Cow Creek, it doesn't either, I don't think, yeah. But anyway, and the population of Chicopee in western Massachusetts is 56,000. So there's only like a 55,500 difference between the 2. Okay, that's Chicopee. We don't know, how did that come about? The last one is Frontenac. Now, Frontenac is the second largest city in Crawford County right now. You know, it's almost 4,000 people. It's actually 3,300 or whatnot. It was a coal mining community. It started out as Santa Fe Number 1. That was the name of the mine that they had there. And it was part of the Cherokee Crawford coalfields. Of course, as Jerry has done such great research on, November 9th, 1888 was the horrible mining accident, which was the worst in the state. But during that whole decade, the 1900s into the 20th century, the immigrants who came to Frontenac, you know, all from, you know, Sicily, Italy, all the Slavic places, Eastern and Southeastern countries in Europe, just filtered through the city, and of course they stayed on after the coal seams were dry. But Frontenac had another peculiar sort of talent, and if you read any of the histories, you see that, you know, they had a lot of ethnic lodges, but they also had a lot of drinking parlors. They had drinking parlors, according to this one piece of history that I read, despite the state's increasingly severe ban on the distribution, sale, and manufacturing of alcoholic beverages. They kept that tradition going. Now, I don't know if that gives you a second city status or not, but you know, why were they named Frontenac? That was the whole point. Well, as I said, they were Santa Fe Number 1, and Robert Craig was the superintendent at that time of the Southern Kansas Railway that later became the Santa Fe, and he said, we'll call it Craigsville. Robert Craig, Craigsville. Topeka said, you know, you got to record it, let us make it official. Robert submitted Craigsville for Frontenac initially, and went to Topeka. And on December the 16th, 1886, he was confounded and astounded. Something happened, and the Girard Press reported the next day that he came back confused, but it was named Frontenac officially. Well, some lore says, well, it probably had to do with Fort Frontenac in Canada, because the Santa Fe, you know, it was recruiting, you know, people to work the mines, the miners from all over. So that's where they probably got the name. Well, okay, Fort Frontenac, what does that mean? So I looked up Frontenac, and he happened to be a French soldier at one time. And in the 1600s, actually from 1689 to 1698, under King Louis XIV, he came to this new French land right here and established, you know, right where the Great Lakes were, and did establish a number of forts and fought a series of battles against the English and the Iroquois. So I'm not sure if our speaker can kind of clear up some of these myths for us, but those myths remain. We celebrate these places that we live in, and a lot of times we don't know what's the history behind them. So for that long introduction, I want to now start by saying that today I'd like to welcome DeanaStaresicic-Dean for a presentation that she's doing today for the Humanities Kansas Speakers Bureau called Researching Your Home and the People Who Live There. If you would, you know, the Humanities Kansas is an independent nonprofit organization leading a movement of ideas to empower the people of Kansas to strengthen their communities and our democracy. And if you would take a moment to turn off your cell phones so that we can all enjoy the program if you haven't already. Deana grew up in Kansas City, Kansas, and currently calls Ottawa home. She is the executive director of the Franliin County Historical Society and the O Depot Museum in Ottawa. She is interested in collecting, interpreting, and recording local histories, and she is particularly interested in learning about microhistories, which is the history of a single person, a single place, or a single object. Deana is also the author of a book called Shadow on the Hill, the true story of a 1925 Kansas murder. She can be found exploring old cemeteries and searching for remnants on historic trails. Please welcome with me DeanaStaresicic-Dean.
There we go. Okay. Sounds good? Okay. If you can't see the screen, rearrange yourself so that you can. because I have a lot of pictures and things. But before I do anything else, can we give a round of applause to Linda for that extraordinary introduction? That was a amazing history in like 6.5 minutes. So thank you for that. And it kind of leads to what I want to talk about. So first, I'm really excited to be here. I visited this museum about 10 years ago. This is a small but mighty history museum, and I love it. And I love it in part because Crawford County has a very unique history in Kansas. My county had mines, but they were like side hustle mines, not the dominant driving force of economy. And then when they ran out, it was no big deal. They just went back to cattle. So I really am fascinated by the history here. And it really, really impacts what you're going to learn about your spaces. So why I love this program so much is because even people who aren't necessarily self-identifying as history people are interested in the history of their spaces. They want to know about their house or the building that their business is in or the farmland that they have. And so what we'll talk about are the tools to get those things researched and then how to tell that story. So my own love affair with house history actually starts with my love affair with true ghost stories. Back when I was about 9 years old, Scholastic magazine, they used to send those little flyers home with you when you're in elementary school. And I stocked up on true ghost stories by Daniel Cohen and true crimes. And in hindsight, I'm questioning whether it was a good idea for a 9-year-old to be looking at murder scene photos from the Lizzie Borden axe murders. But this is who I am today as a result. This particular picture is of the Brown Lady of Raynham Hall. Her name was thought to be Lady Dorothy Walpole. She lived from 1686 to 1726. And in 1936, Country Life magazine was there photographing the house, and you can see her visage was coming down the stairs, and they rushed over and they took a picture of her, and there she is in all her glory. And I was enthralled with this, not so much I realize now because she was a ghost. Actually, if it's not a house you like, it's kind of devastating to think you'd be trapped there forever. But because she was a connection to the past. She was a conduit to an earlier story of a property, and I really loved that so much. So that kind of got my house history love affairs started. There are some handouts going around. One is about the resources I'm going to talk about. So you've got all the websites and locations and things on there already. You can add more notes if you want to. And another is about how to read land descriptions, because it turns out a lot of people don't know how to do that, especially if you grew up in a town where you just had a lot. So those are going around here in just a bit. All right, so let's look at some concepts here I want to get across. The first big one is that real people lead real lives in real houses. And I stress this because I've run into people who think there's nothing to research just because they live in a 1950s ranch house, or they built their house last year, although a huge part of your story last year is how expensive it was to build, or that they don't even have a house. But the truth is, every space has a story. So even, you don't have to have a notorious house, you don't have to have a grand house. If you have a farm field, that farm field has a history, and it's worth the trouble to tell that story. So don't be discouraged if you don't feel like you have an old house. So this question seems a little silly. Where are you? But it's actually a really important question, because it turns out how we identify where we are changes depending on what time period we are. Here's a map. This is a map of Pomona, Kansas, which is about 10 miles west of Ottawa, where I live. You will notice the street names are in two colors. They are in black and they are in red. So the old street names are East A, B, C, D. Those are red. The new street names are named after US presidents. If you live on Truman Street now and you did not know this, your research would dead end a bit, when you didn't realize that you were actually on a letter street 20 years ago, 30 years ago. So a lot of changes happened as a result of implementing 911 systems, right? A lot of rural streets that were just, you know, that street where Bob's family lives. Turns out that's not the easiest way for a 19-year-old EMT driver in the rain to find you when you're having a heart attack. So they went through and they made a lot of changes. And of course, city names change, county names change, cities get incorporated into other cities. And so what you'll see is a lot of these amazing changes that happen. I think the craziest one that I've seen was actually in Basehor, Kansas, which is in Leavenworth County. So a lot of counties, when they had to implement street names, they were not creative. Lyon County, where Emporia is, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, right? And then 100, 200, 300, 400. Now the advantage is, if you can get to a street corner, you can pretty much figure out where you are in the county, right? Well, Leavenworth County saw that Wyandotte County and Kansas City was encroaching to that county line. So they said, you know what, we're just going to continue the street numbers. So it's like 145, 146, 147 is where the county numbers start. But then they got to Basehor, which is sort of down in there, and it was what I consider like the classic small Kansas town, where you have numbers and then the tree streets, Maple, Oak, Hickory. But when the numbers got there, they realized that they were not lining up. They were lining up with the tree street. So they took the map and they turned it 90 degrees. So all of the tree streets became number streets, but not 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They continued 154, 155, 156. And then all of the number streets, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, became tree streets. So my brother now lives in a house that's like 15632 Hickory, but would have been like 3rd Street previously. So if you don't know that, you dead end pretty fast when you're trying to do research. So what we need then is our legal description, and that's why I do have one of those handouts. Legal descriptions are cumbersome. These are not something you'd give to your Uber driver. This happens to be the address for the Ottawa Friends of the Library. So if you're ever in Ottawa and desperately need books to read, please stop by. They'd love your support. But how do we even get that? So in early history of American white settlement, we just brought these basic land descriptions, and a lot of them read kind of like 40 paces from the goodsmith's red barn to the bur oak tree stump to the creek. And what is wrong with all of those kinds of land descriptions? They change. Yes, barns burn down, creeks shift, the tree stump burns up, the rock rolls away. So they realized they needed something a little bit more stable. And so they adopted the Public Land Survey System in 1785. And so this system basically brought out these surveyors, and you see he's got a Gunter chain. The Gunter chains the links are 7.92 inches long, and there's 100 links in a chain. The chain is 80 feet. And then you've got, my brain just blanked out, 66 feet. Then you've got 80 chains that makes a mile. A square mile, of course, is a section, and then 36 sections is a geographical township. So the nice thing about that is then you make these beautiful grids. It's so elegant. It's like playing Battleship. You can always figure out where you are. And the thing about that legal description is it does not change, regardless of if the county line shifts, if the city boundaries shift. None of that changes. You can always identify where you are. If a reservoir is put in the middle of it, if a volcano pops up in the middle of it, it's still the same land description. So knowing your land description always helps you figure out if you're talking about the right place when you're doing research. It gives you a place to start. So with that in mind, where do you find that darn legal address? If you own your home or have a mortgage on your home, it will be on your description. If you don't, or if you're just curious about someone else's legal description, you can actually go to your county website and you can either click on the map or you can plug in your current street address and it will pop up your legal description. Once you have that, we go on a field trip. This is our first field trip, y'all. Register of Deeds office, and here's the thing to know about your Register of Deeds. They are the historians of the land. And their job is to maintain a sort of genealogy of every single person who has owned the land. They do not care about anything on the land, no houses, nothing like that. They're interested in who is in every time that land changes hands. And so the kinds of things we can find are everyone who's ever owned it, any easements, any leases, any mortgages, sheriff sales. There are a lot more of those than you'd think. Very exciting to think about somebody's big farm sold for $12, but they happen. But if your county is still using a lot of paper, you might see an index like this, where in town you might have an addition within that township range and section, and then it'll have lots. And then you can see those X's. That's every time there was some sort of change that happened to that land. And then it tells you what book to go to find the document. Pretty cool. And the really cool thing is now with cell phone cameras, you don't have to pay to print all these out. You can just take pictures. Yes. So you can collect all of this information. And so we're at that Register of Deeds office. You can find everyone who's owned it, every time the land is subdivided. Maybe you live in a 1950s house that is somewhere that used to be a farm. You know, the land was bought and sold, it was on the edge of town, they subdivided it. You can find out when. Sheriff sales, oil and gas leases, and then usually the Register of Deeds is also a great resource for maps. And your Register of Deeds has a lot of other cool stuff too, cemetery information and some other things that you can find there. If you've never done this before, just call ahead and say, hey, I want to do this, because if you show up, inevitably it'll be that one day where everybody needs something, and they really want to give you their time to help you find what you want. The Register of Deeds staff are usually pretty amazing. Anyone have an abstract for their property? Oh, so a few of you? Okay. So abstracts predate, they kind of stopped making them about the 1980s-ish when we went to title insurance and very computerized means of keeping track of a lot of this information. But what used to happen is the title company would basically, you'd have this sheaf of paper and it had every single document connected to your house. When it was sold, if there was something legal happening against your house. The abstract to my house in Emporia, back when we lived in Emporia, had divorce after divorce after divorce after divorce, which was kind of ominous, actually. But it has all the same information you can find at the Register of Deeds office. The only additional thing is anything legal. You can technically go to a title office and have one made. It is very expensive. When I checked, it was about $4 to $6 a page. And if you have a house or a property that's 100 and some years old and changed hands every 5 years, that's a lot of paper. This abstract page came from my abstract in Emporia, and actually this is my chance to find out who our true crime aficionados are here. We found out that our house actually belonged to Marty and Lorna Anderson. Who are Marty and Lorna Anderson? Lorna was the secretary. Okay, so early 1980s in Emporia, this was their big notorious crime. The minister, Tom Byrd, and his secretary, Lorna Anderson, had an affair, and they were both convicted of doing away with their respective spouses. And they owned our house. And it was very stressful. This was in just a couple of years before Marty was killed, but it kind of led some insight into what was going on, because they had 2 outstanding mortgages on that house. It was a rental property. They had skipped out renters and who owed them $2,000, which in the I think it's a lot of money now, but it was a lot of money in the 1980s in Emporia. So it kind of lends us a little bit of insight into maybe what was going on in their story. So those are the kinds of things that you can sometimes come across. Okay, how did the first owner get his or her land in Kansas? And there's a big asterisk there, and that is because that question a lot of times is, who did the government declare the original owner? But let's be honest, was Kansas vacant when settlers started coming in? No, it was not. There were all kinds of people who lived here for centuries. They had families, and they worked here, and they hunted here, and they worshiped here. And I think it's really important when you're telling the story of your property to acknowledge that. You won't necessarily be able to say who lived there because there aren't land records of the same way, but there are some really great ways to at least be able to acknowledge which communities of indigenous people were connected to your space. On your handout, there's actually a really neat one. There's a couple of neat ones that you'll see listed where it can tell you about the different tribes that were connected to your land just by knowing what your zip code is. So it's a great part of the story of your space, and I really encourage you to include that when you're doing the history of your property. So the question of who owned it first, we're going to say, is when the U.S. government assigned it to somebody officially from their perspective. Up until the pandemic, I would tell you, you would need to go to Family Search and flip through 72 volumes of the original land deeds until you found the correct section, township, and range, and then you could find out who happened to have the land that your property is on. One of the few good things to happen during the pandemic is, by golly, the Bureau of Land Management uploaded all these records and made them searchable. Yay! This is exciting. So you can actually, you don't even have to know the address. You can just right-click on the map of your property, and it will pull up the right township. And because you've got your land description, you can then figure out where you are. Now remember, the kinds of land grants that happened were bigger than your house in town, right? You're talking about a much bigger property. And I looked through a lot of the land grants from here. It looks like they start in 1870. And the surveying was finished of this land area in 1867. And we'll look at an example of some of those surveys. So you can find the original land grant deed connected to your property through that. And so this one happens to be, I can't remember who I pulled up. I pulled up someone from 1870. A lot of times you'll see they homesteaded, or in my area, there were a lot of people who got it for connected to serving in a militia in 1812. So you see a lot of different ways people get land in an area. But you can pull up the deed connected to the property your property is sitting on. Okay, so we're learning a lot of stuff about how to figure out where we're at so far. Maps that are in the biggest letters I could possibly put on here, because I love them so much with my whole heart. I can look at maps for hours and hours and hours having absolutely nothing to look for because they're so interesting to me. So we're going to talk a little bit about how to use a variety of maps to help you learn more about your house and your property. So you remember these guys? Picture them. They were sent out to Kansas Territory. They started on the east side because that's where they could get to, and they slowly worked their way west. They started in 1855, and I think they made it to like Colby in 1878. Picture them carrying those chains up and down the state, okay? Kind of amazing. So one of the things they were doing was they were documenting everything that wasn't grass that was remotely interesting, in addition to surveying. So what you can see on this one, this is actually a couple of counties away because it has a lot of good examples of what kinds of things they found. This is in Butler County. I'm going to zoom in a little bit here. So what kinds of things do you think you're seeing? You can just shout out what you think you're seeing in here. Creeks? Yeah, what do you think the green stuff is around the creek? Yeah, that was the trees, right? Just whatever you had right around the creeks. And what about this? Nope, it won't show. Let me wander over here. What about things like this?
Yeah,
Cultivated fields. Okay, so this is this one. Let me go back real quick here. This was finished in 1861. So we've got some cultivated fields. And then what are all those like squiggly things around there?
Trails.
Trails and roads, yeah. So in Kansas, we tend to think about the big trails, right? Santa Fe Trail, Oregon Trail, Chisholm Trail, Smoky Hill Trails. But we forget that there's the trail that connects your house to your aunt and uncle's house, or your house to the creek, or your house back to wherever you can possibly get on a train. And they usually took the path of least resistance because there were no dozers and equipment that were going ahead of you to make a nice smooth road. So it's so interesting to think about. Some of these roads become roads. They're the squiggly ones that are really fun to drive on and not the section roads, right? But some of these roads are in your living room because you've since developed over it. Some of these are going through your local grocery store. So it's really interesting to think about where those roads are and how people moved through. And this map, we're actually right on the outside of this map, but it's a cool map, so I'm going to use it anyway. This is Gunn's map of Kansas and the gold mines. And you might ask, what gold mines? Where were the gold mines in Kansas in 1859? Where was Kansas in 1859? Where did western Kansas end in 1859? Colorado went right up to the Rockies, right? And so yes, by golly, it was Kansas to the gold mines. So looking around here, you see, what is this? McGee, what the heck is that? What's McGee County?
It's where we are right now.
It is where we are right now. McGee was actually one of the original 1855, original 33 counties. It was never actually organized. And this county was carved out of the north part of McGee, right? So we are there. We're just sort of not yet surveyed in 1859. But what you can see, look at all the trails connecting all the little towns and spaces and people all over the place. And just to further give an example of this, so this is actually bridge number 3 for Main Street in Ottawa, which is where I'm from. And I love this picture so much. This is the dedication of the bridge. It's 1926. You can't really tell, but it's actually raining. That's why you can see all the umbrellas. But what's interesting about this picture has nothing to do with the bridge. It's what's going on in the background. So Ottawa is where it is. Franklin County, the Meridocene River goes right through the middle of it from west to east, right? So if you look at the old trails in Franklin County, it's a story of where can you cross the river. And the location of Ottawa was one of those places. So you see, it's like an hourglass, like all these trails do this at Ottawa. There's just a few other places around where you can ford it. Now you can only ford it when it's not flooding. And as you'll hear me say, Ottawa floods enthusiastically and often. But the original road was Hickory Street, not Main Street. And you could still zip your car when it wasn't flooding right across this until they finished the flood control project and the levees went in. And that was in 1959. And in fact, when they built the first Main Street bridge, it was built by businessmen. And they charged a toll, and there are these hilarious photos of this suspension bridge mostly empty, and everyone taking the ford because they weren't going to pay a stinking toll if they didn't have to. So that it kind of tells you like the road isn't always where you think it might be. Okay, let's talk about plat maps and plat books. Has anyone ever looked at one of these before? Linda, do you have a plat book here, a plat map? Do you have one? The 1906? Nope. Okay, I know they have one at the Pittsburgh Public Library.
And they have in special collections.
Yes, they have one there, and you can also access it through the Kansas Historical Society website. You can just flip through the pages. So the wonderful thing about plat books is particularly if you're looking at rural land. And the neat thing about this county is land that is currently rural was not necessarily as rural as you'd think. This is from the 1906 book, and this is actually where we are now. And I'm going to zoom in on this just a little bit so you can kind of see what we're looking at here. First of all, as Linda was saying earlier, there are all these little like town and camp names. They are not on the map anymore. but they are on the 1906 map. And this one right here, you see what is this? Right here, what is that? It's a little company town, isn't it? Right? Look at all those teeny houses. This is a field now. There is no sign of this when you look at the Google satellite image. You'd never know that there were like 30 houses there. That's so interesting to me. You can see the railroads. All those little squares everywhere, these are all residences. All those little squares. And a lot of times those houses disappear over time, right? Because people who farm fields, if they're not living in that house, why pay the taxes on a residence instead of just the agricultural field, which is a lot less. You can see creeks. They're little schools. Let me see if I can spot one for you here. Right here. School number 107. They usually denote churches, cemeteries. Who owns the land? A lot of land here was owned by mining companies. A lot of land. Astonishing amounts of land. And you can actually, there's some genealogy that happens here. You're like, how did he end up marrying her? And you go, oh, they were neighbors. This all makes sense now. So there's a lot of information to be gleaned. And if you currently live in a property that is not as old, it's maybe a farm that was sold off and developed on the edge of town, you can still find your history through this. You can also sometimes see how waterways change. You can see how communities change. You can see cities get developed and then disappear. You can see name changes. There's a lot of information that you can get from this. And this particular map, as I said, is available at the library in Pittsburgh or online at the State Historical Society website, kansasmemory.org, and you can just look at all the pages. Okay. Now, if you're in town, has anyone ever looked at a Sanborn fire insurance map before? They are the coolest maps. They are my personal rabbit hole. And you guys have a lot of them for this county. We don't have any for Frontenac or for Franliin, but astonishingly for Mulberry and Walnut, and I'm still trying to figure out why, because those are really small communities. But you have a lot of them. These are 5,300 pages of these maps have been scanned and are available for you to look at online for free. So go play with them, even if it's not in an area that you are researching. So here's how these maps are different. They were developed by insurance companies and fire departments to assess fire risk and then assess water availability. So they are not, it's not like a topographical map or a road map. They are interested in every single structure, what those structures are made of, and what those structures are used for. So they draw in the outhouses and the chicken coops and the sheds and the garages and all of it. It's all in there. And they tell you about them. So this one, this one is Mulberry, and excuse me, it's 1913. And so we're going to zoom in and look at this a little bit so you can see what we have. So first of all, the first thing I can tell you is in 1913, Mulberry had running water. There's your water line. And then the little black dots are hydrants. If you look at early maps for my town, Ottawa, there are blue dots everywhere. Those are wells. And it's a little disturbing, actually, because every backyard had one, which makes you think about that when you're out mowing your lawn. Like, where was the well? And who filled it in? And I will tell you, when I did this program in Iola, no fewer than 3 people came up to me and told me their I fell down a well story. Be careful in Allen County, people. I don't know what was going on there. So, but other things that you can see, yellow is wood frame, okay? Pink is brick. Blue is going to be stone or concrete. And then up at the top there, you can see one building that's outlined in gray. It had iron cladding, which was really common for Victorian buildings. You can see DWGs, or just Ds for dwellings. And in this one, you can see there's a Masonic hall that's mentioned. There's a furniture store that's mentioned. There's a livery stable that's mentioned. So there's a lot of information, and they're really accurate. I mean, they tell you how many floors, how many windows, where the windows are, whether there's a porch, where the doors are, because these were all things that firefighters needed to know. You betcha that the foundry was going to have a totally different kind of risk than a church, right? So those are all things that they were interested in. Now, maps often got updated, and they're very expensive. The community typically bought one, like a bunch of the insurance companies and the fire department would pool their resources. But the Sanborn Fire Insurance Company, which was making these from about the Civil War-ish up until, and they kept making new ones till about the 1920s. After the 1920s, they sold you things that you pasted in to make corrections. So we have, in our collection, we've got like a 1924 one that has paste-ins from the 1930s. And you're like, but I want to see what's underneath there. You can't. But they have scanned everything that is out of copyright at KU's website, and you can click through them and look at them all to your heart's content. They're really interesting. And if you happen to be researching a property that is in one of these maps, you can, especially in a town that had multiple, like every few years, you can sometimes see the building change shape, additions get added, additions go away, and it can kind of tell you a bit about what was happening with your building. Okay. So we're learning how to use maps, and now let's think about the people who are connected to the spaces. So the first place we can talk about, of course, is the U.S. Census. That's a great place to start. Has anyone here looked at census records before? Yes, okay. So the tough part about the U.S. Census that we'll talk about in a second is what's available and what isn't. But when you have a census record, it tells you everyone who lived there. And as we know, sometimes the people who own the property and the people who live at the property are not the same people. So this can help us identify new people to research in connection with our property. Sometimes it can also help us figure out why it looks the way it does. Sometimes you'll see a house where there's a part of the house that you can't access the other part of the house from the inside. And then you find out it was a doctor's office. Pretty common, right? Because they built the business there, but it's not, they didn't want people to be able to come in and out of the house. So you might see things like that. And you might go, oh, this house has some amazing woodwork. And then you find out it was built by a carpenter. And so you might get some insight like that. But here's some amazing things and some limitations. So the first Kansas census was 1860. It was still Kansas territory at the time. The federal census comes out every 10 years, but there's a big hole in 1890 because it burned up in a fire in 1921. Kansas records are gone. That's a rough one for Kansas because think about how much change was happening in Kansas between 1880 and 1900. A lot of your people who are going to be your World War I vets are being born about that time. So it's kind of a rough hit. Kansas census, which I don't think that there is one anymore, but they used to do one on the 5. So it does kind of fill in the gap, but it's usually not as rigorous in terms of the information that was collected. But it does help you identify everyone who lived there, a lot of times what they did, and a lot of times where they came from. Okay. City directories. I don't know are there city directories available anywhere for any of the cities in? Yes, no, maybe? At the library? Okay. If your town has been covered by city directories, and they are different from phone books, right? Because a city directory covers everyone regardless of what their phone status is. If you have city directories, you can look things up by reverse address, by name, or by also later by telephone. The thing about city directories is they don't have that same commitment to accuracy, and once in a while you'll see people resurrected from the dead 5 years later. You will see names spelled wrong, or businesses that closed 5 years ago suddenly show up again, or properties listed as vacant when they're not. But it can give you some really great filling in between censuses. And this is especially great if you're researching those downtown types of properties that have a second floor, and think about how quickly businesses and people go in and out of those properties. Renters who open a business, it's open for 8 months, it disappears. You have tenants on the second floor, you might have a doctor's office, you might have someone renting an apartment, you might have a lawyer who's only there for a short time, and that can help you identify all the people who use that building, because a lot of those downtown block buildings were really real estate developments. The people who built them and owned them didn't necessarily actually use them. They were just renting them out. It was a real estate development. So these can be very helpful if you're lucky enough to have them for the area that you're researching. Other really great things to look for, probates and wills, those are public record. Vital statistics are tricky because in Kansas, anything that after 1911, when the state became the owners of those records, is not public information. So if your county was maintaining those records up through 1911, those are public documents and you can research them. Amazingly, you will find that there are counties like Johnson County said, oh, we're not responsible, pitch them. All their births, deaths, marriages were pitched. I know, right? My heart kind of broke. But some places they donated those to historical societies or they kept them in other ways. Vital statistics after 1911, you have to somehow justify why you have the right to that information. And it's kind of a pain. My dad passed away last year and I had to remember my address from college to go buy a copy of his death certificate because I had to prove that I was really connected. So it's really kind of hard. Meanwhile, if you're researching in Missouri, you can just go to the archive site, type in the name, and it pops up the records. So every state is a little different. Cemetery records, the Public Library in Pittsburgh has them. The Register of Deeds has a lot of them too. Biographical files, yearbooks, community museums and libraries like this one that have a lot of information. University and college collections have information. The Kansas Historical Society has information. And today, any social media groups, every town has some sort of remember when or you know you're from if. In fact, ours just finally corrected the grammar. It said you're from Y-O-U-R. And after much protesting in the kingdom, they finally fixed it. But a lot of times people post pictures and they don't even understand what they're posting. Like they're posting a picture of the parade, but it's your house that's in the background. So keep an eye on those groups if you're doing research. And then there are photographs. And photographs tell us a lot of information, but the trick is to know how to research them. So my historical society owns 37,000 photographs. If you come in and you say, I would like a photo of 234 Hickory Street, we'll say, why? Think about how most historical societies get their photos. You're cleaning out grandma's attic. You're in from California for 1 week. You take this box to the historical society. These are in my grandma's attic. We know some of these things. We know this was grandma's first house. We don't have any idea where grandma's first house was. And the Historical Society does everything they can to try to identify it, but they often don't quite have enough information. You have been collecting a lot of information about names of people who are connected to your space and about other things, addresses, other possible things connected to your space. And we can creatively sometimes find information that we didn't know we could find because of that. So let's look at this picture. This is one of my favorite photos. This is downtown Burlington during the 1926 flood, another community that floods enthusiastically and often. It's by Louis Polensky, who was a photographer who traveled around Kansas a bit. It is a sumptuous photo. Why? It's on a 17-inch negative. So much detail in this photo. You can blow it up. It is listed as being of the flood. But what else is in this building? This is downtown Burlington. This is business buildings in Burlington. And there is enough detail that you can see architectural details. You can see the name of businesses. There's a lot of information. You won't find it by the address, but if you're looking at it, you're going to recognize your buildings. And so you might learn a lot about what's going on in your building from a photograph like this. Also, it was wet. Look for events connected to your building. This one is Girard High School Band campaigning for Alf Landon, October 1934. And this building's still standing. It is 128 East Forest Avenue. I was able to spot it pretty easily, even though that little pointy top part there on the corner, that's gone. but you can recognize the building because of those beautiful little squares around the windows. So it's still standing. Is it identified as being 128 East Forest? No, but it's Girard, and so you can start looking around at those downtown buildings and you can find it. And so it is still standing, as is its next door neighbor, though it's looking like it could use a little love. But the buildings are still there. Okay, also tornadoes, floods, parades, there's always somebody out taking a picture. In my town, whenever they're about to close the gates on the levee, everyone rushes out to the higher Prairie Spirit Trail Bridge, which is the old Santa Fe Railroad Bridge, to watch them close the gates on the Main Street Bridge, and they're all taking pictures, lots of pictures of what's going on downtown. It's a sport, it's what we do. And so there's always photos. In fact, we have 1,100 flood photos in our collection. 1,100. Oh, so I love this picture. This is Emily Jane Holman feeding her chickens on a farm west of Lebo. It doesn't tell me where the farm is, but if I'm researching and I find out the Holmans owned my land, this could be my land. And yes, it's a charming little picture of her with her chickens, but what's in the background? There's a house. So there's some information. Maybe this house is not even there anymore, but you know it was. Okay. This one's actually a bit local too, and it was so weird. I was listening to an interview, a podcast interview with Deborah Blum, who was talking about the history of poisons that used to go into our food before there was any sort of regulation, and Upton Sinclair, and the fact that he published his book in serial in the paper in Girard, just as I literally clicked on this photo, which is a picture of the press in Girard that published it. How amazing. So here's an interior photo of the way this building was used. I don't know if the building's still there. I don't know if what it's used for now, if it is, but this sure tells you a lot about what that space looked like in 1950. This one's really fun. This is Brother Walter and myself at his spring near his house near Blaine, Kansas in 1907, and it was in an album called Breweries and Bootlegging. And the next picture talks about the Schlitz. So this is about bootlegging in someone's farm. They're keeping it cool in the spring behind the house. So if you know who Brother Walter is and you live near Blaine, this might be your property. Maybe the spring is still there, maybe it's not. A little bit different here. Here's an interior shot. This is Joseph and Josepha Fuchs Erbert in the town of Ellis in Ellis County, 1896. It's an interior photo, and it's pretty nice for 1890s because there aren't a lot of interior photos. They're hard to light. But look at what we can see about them and what matters to them and what we can see about their house. Look at the plank floorboards. Look at the woodwork. Look at the religious iconography. Faith was obviously very important to them. A lot of information about their house and how they lived in this very simple photo. All right. This one is a wonderfully weird photo. I love it a lot. This is the Barber Shop and Baker Company Funeral Home. Same door. In DeSoto in Johnson County, sometime between 1900 and 1920. We get a lot of, why did they make him come out with his face lathered up? I mean, and they just look so unhappy about this photo. Yeah, like they couldn't finish before they took this picture. So there's a lot of structural information about the building, but what else is in this picture? The reflection of the buildings across the street. Is it a great picture of the building across the street? No. But does it help you verify the shape of the building and what might have been there? Absolutely does. And you might find this, you run into this a lot with downtown buildings or with plate glass. In our town, if you want a photo of the east side of Maine, you're in better luck than the west side, because when they're photographing parades, they usually were on the west side shooting east. So we have a lot more photos of that side of the building, but they have plate glass. So sometimes if the light's hitting right, you can see what's across the street. So you may have to get a little creative sometimes in how you look at photos. And sometimes it's not a photo at all. So this is a sketch of Caldwell down in Sumner County. It's by Ado Hunius. He was a cartographer who was hired to go along with the military from fort to fort to fort. He drew some pretty amazing maps, but he also sketched and he journaled about his adventures. You can actually read all of his journals online through the State Historical Society website. It's a sketch of Caldwell. Is this a great drawing of Caldwell? It is not. But what does it tell us? What's prominent in Caldwell? The hotel. And so you have this beautiful hotel, but what's right behind the hotel? It's a log cabin with a little well, right? So it kind of tells you where this town was in its development at that time. You've got this nice fancy fronted hotel, but it's attached to a little primitive log cabin and a well in the back. It kind of gives you a sense of where Caldwell was. And then be on the lookout for real photo postcards. Once the U.S. Postal Service started letting people mail postcards that they made themselves, Kodak came out with a camera that let you take pictures and make your own postcards. And a lot of these, there aren't necessarily tons of them out there, but people took them of themselves, of places they visited, of their homes and businesses. I found this one in an antique store for 99 cents plus tax. And I'll be honest, I bought it because of the kind of snotty writing on the back. Dear Kennedy, what is the matter with you? I have written you twice and Johnson once, and you'll never hear from you. But it goes on to say, this is my new store building. How do you like it? Ask Mr. K what he thinks of concrete for a building, solid concrete, except the ceiling and the roof. This is the origin story of this building. And I was able to find it. It was in Ottawa. See, it flooded enthusiastically and often. It started out as the company for the J.C. Pettit Tin Factory, and he put the tin ceilings up in most of our buildings. He went on to do duct work in a lot of houses, and then they ultimately sold the building to a creamery, and then by 1930s it had taken one too many floods, and that was the end of it. But here's the origin story for 99 cents plus tax, which is fantastic. So be on the lookout for these real photo postcards. And newspapers. What's great about newspapers for smaller communities is that everyone's business is everyone's business in those early papers. I know that the man who built my house had a carbuncle on his neck because, dang it, it was in the paper. And every town early on wanted to have a paper or a competing paper because that's how you were a real town, right? So the really great thing for Kansas is that the State Historical Society, and I did not know this until recently, the State Historical Society is one of the largest repositories for newspapers in the entire world. Our State Historical Society, okay? There's a really great presentation that you can actually watch in the archives of the state on their YouTube channel. There was a man who went around, he was trying to photograph every building connected to a newspaper, whether the paper was still there or not. And he talked about the fact that our state archives has pretty much more newspapers than any other place in the entire world. Mind-blowing. They have worked with newspapers.com to scan everything up through 1924, that magic copyright date. So you can, and they're still adding, but you can pretty much access anything for free through the State Historical Society website and do research. And the thing is, they are searchable. Searchable, you can put in names, you can put in addresses, you can put in street names. You will find how often they misspelled things. I dread for some future descendant of mine to see what they can do with Staresinic-Dean. And my first name, which they spell wrong a lot. You wouldn't think Diana would be so hard, but there you go. But you can find all these papers online, and then you've also got them on microfilm at the libraries, and you've collected all these names. So you not only have addresses, you have names of people to look for. And sometimes you'll see a story that's like Grant Crane on Cedar Street. Well, it doesn't have an address, but you know he's your Grant Crane on Cedar Street. so you know it's about your house or about your Grant Crane. So take a look at this. You can also, if you're really dedicated, you can also go get your own subscription. If you have an Ancestry.com subscription, it's like $50 a year to get a newspapers.com subscription. So just so you know, but you can access a lot of that information for free. And a lot of towns, maybe they had a paper for 3 months. Loup, Kansas in Franklin County, 3 months, but it was a documented 3 months. So there's information. Okay, and houses move. And they moved a lot. Why waste good materials? Lumber is dear. Windows are dear. Pick up the frame house and move it. If you find out that is the case with your house, you have a whole other property to research, right? You've got to go look into that story too. And think about stories in your neighborhood. Sometimes you might be affected by, if your neighbor's house burned down, your house might be in the picture coincidentally. If there's a car accident on your street, your house may be in the background coincidentally. So look for those kinds of things too. We have just found a whole lot of ways to look for information. And the cool thing is so much of this is stuff that you don't even have to leave your house. All you need is internet and you are good, and coffee, lots of coffee, and you will be good to go. But then what do you do with all this? So we're going to take a look at the story of my house. And I live in Ottawa. I'm just near the Ottawa University, like it's just catty corner. And this is an old picture. We have a new porch. My husband fell through this one. But this is the new porch looks like the old porch, but new and improved. It can actually hold weight now. But it's the last time I actually tried with landscaping. Like right now, it is just a jungle. So we still have the old picture. So here's what you need to know off the top. This is the old part. That's the new part. Okay, so file that away. Okay, here's that land tract book. We know that the land my house was originally deeded to the Ottawa Indian tribe. There was a big chunk of land that the tribe exchanged with the Ottawa Township Company for a school. The school gets built in the same year the tribe is moved to Oklahoma. Yeah. Robert Atkinson was a trustee of the school. The school's still there. Now, if you are a member of that tribe, you can go to this school, all expenses paid. That is the one benefit. But Robert Atkinson, he owned actually a pretty good tract of land, and it changes hands a lot. There was a lot of this where people all sort of bought and sold land really rapidly, and land speculation and that kind of thing. Robert Atkinson ends up with a pretty good chunk of the land. And we know when he dies, here's the probate, he died and his heirs got the land. There was also horses, cattle, hogs, and farm implements that it was distributed. Margaret Topping ends up with the land my house is on, but she doesn't want it, so she sells it. She sells it to this fellow. This would be the Grant Crane I just mentioned, the golden curls. And there's the land record that I got through the Register of Deeds office. Now, Grant Crane's family had been in Franklin County since it opened up for settlement. They started in Peoria. A lot of them were business people. He became a school teacher, and he married Laura Shively, and the paper even talked about it. Look at this. It says, Mr. Crane and Miss Shively are two prominent Franklin County teachers, and we wish them unbounded joy and prosperity in their new venture. It'd be nice if we could say such great things about teachers today. We're kind of hard on our teachers right now. So anyway, they get teaching jobs in Richmond, and Crane actually establishes the Richmond High School. And he's there until his wife passes away. And then he decides to move to Ottawa. So we know that she passes away. He moves to Ottawa. He gets a master's degree in accounting from Gem City Business College, which sounds a little sketchy, but there you are. And at this time, he's now teaching at Ottawa University. And he is the admissions counselor, the professor, and the career services guy for those kids. But he's really good at it. One of his students held the world speed record for typing. And think about the typewriters, big manual typewriters. And he could type 249 words a minute, which makes my fingers, like I can feel them sliding between those keys in agony. But he actually went to the exposition in St. Louis and demonstrated, like he was performing typing skills. But so he was really good at what he did, but he also traveled a lot, and you'll see a lot of things like this, right? He went to Kansas City, because that's what they put in the papers. You were leaving town, you were coming into town, you had visitors. But Kansas City plays an important part of our story, so just file that away. Ottawa University builds a new administrative building about 3 days before school was supposed to open. It burns to the ground. The story about it actually says they had just moved in all the equipment. Grant Crane actually, because we're just catty-corner from this building, Grant Crane runs in and tries to save his typewriters, but those typewriters were like 30 pounds, and so he got out with one before he couldn't get back in the building, but one typewriter made it. We know he then goes on to build his own house. R.S. Black sold him a house, and the cool thing about R.S. Black is he was actually a doctor who was hired by the Santa Fe Railroad, and so his office was, until the hospital was built, in the same building where my office has been for the last several years. So there's this nice kind of circle of life kind of thing going on here. But so the house is at 221 Locust, and he moves that house to Cedar Street, where I am now. And so we know it's on Locust because you know those bird's eye view maps, if you've ever seen one of those? So there it is in 1872. And then there is the 1884 map showing that main part of the house. See the pesky well that someone's just waiting to fall into? So we know that it was there. And then it's moved to where it is now, in Cedar Street, and he adds this addition. And they're following along. You know, it mentions it's getting papered and painted. We know this. This is kind of neat. One of the cool things about this picture is it was actually, the name was spelled wrong in our catalog, so I never found it when I was looking for it. And I was literally sweeping the floor, and I look up, I'm like, wow, that kind of looks like my house. That is my house, right there on the wall. But the neat thing that we learn in this is there's a door here that didn't used to be there, which is really interesting. Okay, so we're looking at the city directory. We know he moves in. And he spent time in Christmas in Lawrence, and Miss Ruby Macy spent Christmas in Lawrence. So I was like, that's interesting. Why were they both in Lawrence? Well, see the marriage license? Can anyone see how old they are? Okay. She's 18 and he's 42. Ruby was his student. They tell no one. File that away.
What year was that?
That was 1908. Okay. Or, yeah, wait. Yes, 1908. Or 1909. Let me look here. I think 1908. So this is Ruby up there, by the way. So she's a student. Now Grant Crane's got ambitions. He's like, I don't want to be part of OU anymore. I want to make my own business college. So he starts the process of planning for this modern business college. They will teach typing and accounting and stenography and all those things we desperately need students to know so they can go be successful in the workforce. And she graduates, and now they tell people they got married at the holidays. Not which holidays, but the holidays. And everyone's very happy for them. Meanwhile, his new building that he's building in town for his new school gets held up by the Jeffries-Johnson fight. This is really interesting. Is anyone familiar? Is anyone a boxing history person here? Jeffries-Johnson. Oh, I'm seeing the wheels are turning. It's something. It's tickling something in your head. Yeah. Okay. So the Jeffries-Johnson fight was the white heavyweight champion and the black heavyweight champion. Right? Johnson was the black heavyweight champion, and he won. This fight was, by the way, in Reno, Nevada. We're in 1910 now. Reno, Nevada. The white-owned theaters, which used to play newsreels, refused to show these reels. And it caused riots and striking all over the United States, including Ottawa, Kansas, which slowed down the construction of this building, which is really interesting. but it does get built. It is still standing. Picture Grant Crane on that second floor throwing candy at people to get their attention to enroll. Picture news stories about all the furniture coming in on train cars and they're being hoisted up to the second floor through the windows. That's going on. Everything is exciting. It's very, it's looking like it's gaining momentum. And then this happens. Suit filed for $25,000 in district court today. Miss Ethel McKee alleges large damage because Professor Crane declined to marry her. Remember all those trips to Kansas City? There was another student, and she thought they were engaged. And she didn't know about the wedding till everyone else found out about the wedding, which was a year after the wedding, and she sued him but good. This becomes the most exciting thing to happen in Ottawa that year. The headlines are delightful, but what's really fantastic about this, for me, the researcher, is that they read all 300 of his letters to her on the stand. And the thing about the letters is that they included information about the building of the house because he was sending her to buy furnishings for a house that she would never set foot in. But they tell us when the gas line went in and when the bathroom was built. And the fact that the reason why it has the 2 wings on the first floor and that second door is he built a study and library for his professional side and then the study and dining room on the other side. So he's all this information about why the house looks the way it does. It's because of those letters, which nobody else will care about, but I sure do. So here's this trial, and ultimately the jury says, yeah, he was a jerk. He needs to pay. But the town forgives him. Ruby forgives him. They stay married. He's still a much-loved figure in the community. And his business is doing great. Probably I don't have a barn because he drove into it. And then he dies in my living room after breakfast in the 1930s. And his wife, Ruby, continues to live there. She's now running the business college, which ultimately moves to a new location where the Ottawa Chamber of Commerce is now. And that building is still there. And we know that from the sign, from the old photograph, and we also know from the city directories. Her mother comes to live with her. Her mother dies in the room, likely that is the one I use as my office. And we learn from the city directories that she ends up handing over the management of the business, and she becomes a woman of our heart, the Register of Deeds, right? So now she's the historian of the land. And she's fallen on hard times. She rents out the top floor, and this may explain why the walls are kind of in weird places now, like they don't quite seem like where they should be. And she ultimately has some health issues. So she ends up moving to Neodesha. She sells the house in 1959. She had previously sold off a little chunk of the land to pay inheritance taxes, which is why we have a neighbor behind us whose backyard is like 7 feet deep. But that is, just like the first 50 years of our house, of a house that we didn't buy for the history. We bought the house because it was the least bad house we could afford. And so you never know what story you're going to find attached to your property. So she goes to Neodesha. She lives there actually until 1982 when she passes away there. And that is how you take all of that information and turn it into a narrative about your space. And I keep adding to it. I keep finding stuff. Every time I think I've run out of things, a new newspaper pops up. Ottawa University puts their school papers up on newspapers.com, and now I'm learning about all kinds of things there. So you just never know what you'll find about the story of your house because real people live in your house. And they do wonderful and crazy and weird things just like we do today. And also think about what story we're going to leave for the people researching our property in 50 years or 100 years. So that is the basics of what I wanted to go over today. I am happy to answer any questions. Whew, so much information. Yeah, go ahead.
I don't know if this is a question, but do you see so social media and Facebook and posting of pictures helping this process in the future? We're making it worse.
I think the biggest detriment that we are looking at is going to be the lack of newspapers. Because newspapers used to be so rich in information, and that physical paper, when you look at a page, you're not just seeing that story, you are seeing that story in the context of everything else happening. And you don't have that even with online news sources. And a lot of papers have just sort of gone away. My paper in Ottawa, the Ottawa Herald, I suddenly have feedback. Okay, my paper, I will say Grant Crane will haunt me for a few days after telling his stories. I won't be able to find my keys, so this actually could be him. Our local paper used to be a weekly, and there or a daily, and there also was a weekly. And now we just have a daily, or a once a week paper. And that is all, and they can only cover so much. There's only one reporter now who has to also be the photographer. There's only so much news that she can cover. You're not going to see the who came into towns. A lot of that's now on Facebook. Will Facebook be here in 20 years? Yeah, I mean, look at what's happening to Twitter. It's going to be gone any minute. It's not even Twitter anymore. It's now Z. So my worry is that we have all of this information right now that won't exist down the line. That's my big worry for researching. Because, 150 years ago, I can tell you who was shopping at what store. And now I don't know that we are leaving that same kind of footprint that will last. So that's my biggest worry. But what you can find on social media is a lot of photo sharing, a lot of stories. We had this horrific storm in Ottawa on Sunday of last week. It was an unexpected storm. We were hit by straight line winds that were 80 miles an hour that lasted 20 minutes. Roared through, town looked shredded, telephone poles and electric poles were shredded. There's crushed houses, 4 houses caught fire from lightning and power issues. A semi blows over and blocks I-35 south for a substantial period of time. There's all this, and the Historical Society said, I posted, help us document this, post your storm photos. And so and the location. So we are collecting all of that digital information to save it in our collection because the newspaper will publish one photo. Yeah.
I don't know if it's going to be available, but there are companies out there that have more information about us than any of these newspapers possibly have. They have a record of every item that we bought,
Yeah.
every minute, when we bought it, where we were located, moving from one cell phone tower to another, how often we stayed in every building.
Yeah.
All of that information is out there. If it becomes monetized at some time, these companies
It's
decide to sell
monetized. They sell it to somebody or they wouldn't do it.
Clearly.
But is it accessible to us as researchers? That's another question. I think you had your hand up. Yeah.
Can you tell me how to get a hold of or out of the website for Sanborn Fire Map?
It's on your handout. It is on your handout. You can get them through the KU website, and you can also get them through the Library of Congress. Both of those are free to peruse. For this area, the KU website has more. So I would start there. But the Library of Congress will sometimes add ones that are later than the ones that KU has. So look at both. Did you have a question? No, okay. Yeah.
I have a question about the house numbers on the census.
Mm-hmm.
In the far left column is the house. Are they neighbors? Is that how the numbers go?
In theory, yes. It depends on which census you're looking at. So sometimes with the rural census, there's either no number or it's just the order in which they went to go talk to someone because the rural properties had no house numbers or anything. It was just you were on rural route 2 or whatever. In town, though, usually the house number corresponded to, or the number there corresponded to your house. They're sometimes out of order. House numbers change. Generally now, if you look at a plat map, the house number somehow corresponds to one of the lots that is connected to your property. But like Ottawa, the numbers changed in 1885 because they first had this bright idea that they would just go down the street and name and number the buildings. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then they realized buildings get filled in and they change, and that was a bad idea. And so then they went to what we think of as, your block number. So if you're in the 900 block, it's 901, 902. The west side and the east side have different, one's even, one's odd. So that can change. But usually in the census, for towns, the number that's there usually is the house number. But you need to know whether or not those numbers changed over time. Yep. Yeah.
I have a quick comment. I happen to have a 1907 Crawford County Plat map book. It's not in the best of condition because I bought it from a guy who pulled it off of a burn pile when he thought maybe this is useful, so the back of it's kind of charred.
Wow, good save. 1907, not the 1906?
Oh, 1906.
Okay, but that's still a good one. Yeah.
How much do you use scrapbooks?
If we can, the hard part is knowing what scrapbook to look at. We have a lot of scrapbooks at our collection, but you have to know what's in the scrapbook to know to go to the scrapbook. That's the hardest part. So hopefully if someone has cataloged or indexed them, it's really helpful. Journals can be helpful too. We have a collection of journals that were written, they're called the Sheldon journals. And they wrote down every day what was going on. And that's how we know, for example, which houses were used as makeshift hospitals during the 1918 flu pandemic. Because she just happened to scribble down, oh, this house has now been turned into a hospital for the college students who won't follow the guidelines that the American Red Cross is putting forward, and they're all getting sick. Sometimes there are those kinds of things, but you have to know to look in them. That's the hard part. But they can be really helpful, especially if you know what's in them when you're researching. What else? Okay. Well, I can absolutely hang out for a few minutes if you want to come up. My email address is on that handout too. I love hearing about what you find because I'm nosy about other people's houses. Or if you get stuck and you just want to kind of brainstorm about where else to look, I'm happy to do that too. But otherwise, I'll just hang out until you're ready. Okay.
Okay. Wow. That was wonderful.
Thank you.
I think
We're too close to each
so
other.
Diana will be here. We've got lots of wonderful things to eat for today. And I want to tell you about next month, September 10, will be Larry Fields. Larry has spent a whole lifetime with railroads in 7 countries and doing all kinds of wonderful things out there, but he came back to Pittsburgh and he's salvaged the Frisco Depot building, and he is a preservationist in the best sense of the word. He'll be here for our last program in this series. And Jerry will be out doing house tours. We've got some pizza and some homemade French cookies over there, so you better try those. And now David Wallace has a short announcement, please.
Short. Emphasis on the short. Here, let me have your mic so we don't mess up
Yep.
there. This one here. Yes,
There
thank you.
Yep.
All right. My name's David Wallace, and I got my start in history right here at this museum. I can look around and see the people who taught me anything, everything I've learned about history of this area. Linda Knoll, Larry Spahn, and Jerry Lomshak, and maybe some of the others. Lois is here. And so anyway, I did a display here in 2020. Right at the pandemic, and they left it up for 6 months, and it wasn't really well attended because it's a pandemic, So, out of that, I felt at the time like it didn't really get much air, it didn't get much action. But as a result of that, I started a Facebook page, and it's on my card. I've got some cards here, and you can get one. And I started a Facebook page called Weir City, Kansas History. And so from that, I wanted to expand on that. And so this Weir Homecoming, we're having what I'm calling the Weir City, Kansas History Tent. And I did that because there were no buildings available. The homecoming, every year, everything's full. And so I've got a tent lined up. I've got some tables lined up. I've got a few people lined up to put things in the tent. But what I really want is for people to come and share what they have. Because I have a few things. I did the display. I still have a lot of stuff left. People have things. I'm asking people to put certain things up about Weir City and about the whole area. But I really need, what I really want to see happen, the reason I'm doing this is just to involve, so we can get together and meet and talk and share. And I've been doing videos. That's part of this card I've got here I'm handing out. I'm on YouTube, and this video right here. I've been doing the museum videos. And so, and I've got close to 100 videos up on YouTube. All kinds of different things, a lot of history, trains, interviews with old timers about stuff. But I'd like to have this tent be a place where we can get together and expand on all that. And I want to do videos. I'd like people to sign up to tell their stories. And I'll get together with people and they can tell me their stories. And a lot of oral history there. I've just been amazed at the things people have told me in these interviews. So that's all I got really. It's September the 16th is Weir Homecoming Saturday. I've got a tent, it's 20 by 40, huge tent from Jake's. And from 9 a.m. until 1 p.m., we're going to be there getting together. It's before, during, and after the parade. And I just, you know, I have no idea how it's going to go or what it is. I'm way in over my head, and let's go. Thank you very much.